Okay, thank you very much, Emily, for the introduction. As Emily said, I'm Dr. Susan Quinn, the Programme Manager for the NREC Clinical Trials side of the house, and I'll shortly be introducing my colleague Dr. Lucia Prihodova, Programme Manager for NREC-MD. So a brief overview of what we're going to run through this morning. So firstly, I'm going to discuss the NREC-CT business on that side of the house, hand over to Lucia, and then we're going to do a spotlight on some key topics that were sent in advance. So thank you for all of the excellent questions. And then we'll have a live Q&A, and anything we don't get to, we can answer remotely afterwards. So to talk about the NREC-CT side of the house, I'll first discuss the committees and the remit and the work done to date in that area. So the remit of the NREC-CT is to review the submission of ethics applications related to CTIMPs, or clinical trials of investigational medicinal products. So what this involves is interventional studies and low interventional studies involving medicinal products for human use. And there's a number of excellent decision trees to say, is my study a CTIMP? And I've linked one here at the bottom of the slide, which asks in the annex, is a medicinal product being investigated? What effects of the medicinal product are you looking for? Why are you looking for those effects, and how are you looking for those effects? And there's a number of subsequent sub-menus which help the investigator to see where they fit. So the structure of the NREC-CT is composed of two committees. So we have NREC-CT-A and NREC-CT-B. There's two committees with about 23 members on each, fantastic members across a wealth of different areas, from trials, ethics, clinicians, legal, research. We've got patients, carers, parents, statisticians, health policy, nurses, just a really broad expertise. And we added 10 new members to our committees in the summer of this year. So adding to that expertise and really contributing really well to the committees. The committees meet at 2 main meetings per month and 2 additional subcommittees per month. So we have 4 CT meetings per month, which is very busy and great commitment from both the committees and the National Office team. The reporting is to the Minister for Health, and the operational support comes from the National Office, as I said. So there's a team of 6 on the CT side of the house, a fantastic, hardworking team keeping everything going. And Emily showed the team on her slide, so a big thank you to the team for working so hard on everything. The remit is new clinical trials applications, substantial amendments, safety notifications, and corrective measures. And I've linked to both the committees there. You can click in and see the fantastic expertise across those committees. The volume to date on the NREC-CT side since this was nationalised and launched has been very, very high. So in May 2021, the committees started to review their first applications, and I've highlighted here from 2021, which is May to December of that year, and 2022, which is January to the end of September of this year. So there's been over 100 now at the time of speaking, new trials approved or reviewed by the CT, and 548 substantial amendments. So a huge volume of substantial amendments came through and in front of the committees. I've also included those received and deemed invalid. So these were reviewed by the NREC National Office team. So that, you know, each trial will have been looked at in detail, each substantial amendment, and deemed invalid for various reasons. So that's a total of 647 decisions issued by the NREC-CT and a total of 749 processed. So a really, really high volume has had to be worked through over that time, those 18 months. This is just illustrated further in a graph, those red bars showing the volume of new applications and substantial amendments. I'm going to zoom in now on the substantial amendments further, which, as I said, was an extremely high volume. So 216 were received in 2021 and reviewed, and 332 were reviewed in 2022. So those substantial amendment submissions greatly exceeded the volume forecast, and this resulted in a backlog in early 2022 and late 2021. So the National Office with the NREC and the chairs, and with support from the Department of Health, devised a solution to this ongoing situation. A boot camp was devised, a name which was came up with and stuck, and basically over an 8-week period, 14 members from NREC-CT-A and B came forward to help tackle this task. And over those 8 weeks, 134 substantial amendment applications were reviewed. And you can see in this table the breakdown of numbers reviewed over each week. And in the first week, 20 substantial amendments. There's some of these amendments that have up to 40 documents involved. So really huge workload for the committee, and a huge thank you to them and to Patricia Kenny from the National Office team for running that process. The decision breakdown is shown there also. There was 33 requests for further information, 39 favourable conditions and 62 favourable. So where we're at now is we're at a steady state and planning for a future steady state. So this has been possible due to 10 additional NREC members, allowing us to put these 2 additional subcommittees per month into our calendars and their calendars, and have those planned for without overdoing the burden on a monthly basis on these committee members. There's constant monitoring going on by the National Office team, and particularly Trish keeps an eye on all of those metrics. And the current average time from validation to decision is 25 days. So things are moving along, and we're very conscious of keeping an eye on this at all time. Having looked at where we are so far, I'm now going to focus on where we're going next. So the big change and the big next step for the clinical trial side of the NREC is the upcoming clinical trials regulation. So the clinical trials regulation brings in a new system of applying for clinical trial approval in Ireland to the CTIS, the online system for all of Europe through one portal. So the questions asked are, why is the new clinical trials regulation important for Ireland? So the answer is it fosters innovation across borders and encourages the development of new treatments for patients in Ireland and across Europe. What does the new CTR mean for the patients and public? This means greater transparency in and access to clinical research conducted in Ireland and across Europe. And what does this mean for Irish researchers? So it creates a harmonised system for the assessment of clinical trials in Ireland and across Europe. So a number of huge positives of this coming into force. So I've shown here the timeline. So since the National Office came about in March 2020, and the first applications were reviewed in May 2021, we're quite far along this road now. And you can see there at the last blue dot, the 31st of January 2022, the CTR came into effect. The next orange cross on our journey is upcoming at the end of January next year. All new trials must be submitted under the clinical trials regulation. And then people have up until the 31st of January 2025 to transition across to the CTR from the CTD. Look at that in a little bit more detail. As I said, the CTR came into force on the 31st of January 2022. So we're currently within that 12-month transition period now in October. And as I said, from 31st of January 2023, all trials must come in under the clinical trials regulation. So these applications and the assessments are managed through a new online portal called the CTIS, or the Clinical Trials Information System. The authorization process is then split into 2 stages. So part 1 is a coordinated scientific assessment. This is by the HPRA and the NREC, and also across all of Europe, to have one set of documents for part 1. Part 2 is then an ethical assessment, and that's carried out by the NREC with support from the National Office. These are country-specific and site-specific documents for each member state and according to their own national requirements, so according to our Irish requirements. Each member state will release its own outcome on part 2. I've linked a number of really excellent presentations from colleagues at the HPRA and NREC here below who have touched on this in a lot more detail than I'll go into right now. The big changes for the NREC-CT when we look at it from their aspect is that part 1 and part 2 do not need to be submitted together anymore. So part 1 is the scientific aspect, the protocol, the investigator brochure, and this is common for all member states involved, and there's a coordinated review. And part 2 is the national part, the ethical review of the informed consent, the investigators involved and the sites involved. But the NREC-CT may be reviewing part 1 and part 2 separately, potentially up to 2 years apart. There's no requirement for an applicant to submit a part 2 ever, so they may just get that approval for the part 1 and then not include Ireland or a specific country in that part 2. The NREC-CT will also have only one opportunity to request changes or further information under an RFI for part 1 and part 2. And then conditions as part of a favourable decision are restricted to those that cannot be fulfilled at the time of authorisation. The applicant can also appeal an NREC-CT decision. So as with any major change, there's opportunities and uncertainties involved. The opportunities are vast. There's a harmonised submission, so there's a single entry point, single documentation fee, and for part 1, single fee and a single national decision. It's fostering collaboration, there's improved transparency, and this results in major benefits to Irish patients. The uncertainties at the point we're at now is the volume of submissions that are going to come our way. This, as I mentioned, these delayed part 2 submissions, the strict deadlines under the CTR, and multinational coordination, and of course reliance on volunteer systems of our NREC-CTs who have a multitude of other commitments. To highlight again, the key transitions will be important to investigators here today. As I said, from the 1st of February onwards, all trials must come in under the CTR. So as we publish our cutoff dates for meetings on our website. And as you can see here, our last cutoff day for early 2023 will be the 25th of January 2023. This will be the last date for valid submissions under the CTD. And our next cutoff day from the 8th of February, all new submissions must be under the CTR. to take a very simplified look at the review process, and this is stepping back from part 1 and part 2, the application is submitted to CTIS and there's a validation RFI, and this is a new aspect, and I know this is highlighted in one of the questions, an excellent question. So what will happen here is that the National Office will raise queries in relation to validation, perhaps a signature is missing or a document is incorrect, and the applicant will have time to correct that and continue in this sort of rolling process. Once that's corrected and if valid, they will then undergo NREC review. The NREC will raise an assessment RFI, any concerns they may have, and then there'll be a final decision after the single RFI that will be either acceptable conditions or not acceptable. The EMA publish a report every month showing the volume of applications that have come through CTIS. It's a really useful report to show us where we're at. So this was to the end of August that I'm showing here. So there have been 67 clinical trials with a decision in this online system to date at the end of August. Looking in a little more detail at the commercial versus non-commercial, it's quite an even split, but with 32 non-commercial and 35 commercial. But looking in a little more detail, the dark blue there refers to mononational studies, so a single country, whereas the green refers to multinational, so there's a greater split on the commercial side between those. You can see Ireland there in the middle of this, showing the member state concerned and the CTIS decisions to date. So at the time of the publication, there were 4 under evaluation and 3 authorised, I think. So to zoom in then on our own experience, so we're now having the lived experience of the CTIS system, and there's been a number of positives and a number of learnings. So 6 new applications have come to Ireland through the CTIS system. 3 have been part 1 only, as I mentioned, where this is a scientific aspect only. And for one of these, Ireland was a reporting member state. So that's the lead country, the lead member state involved. And 3 have been part 1 and part 2. We've only received 1 substantial amendment to date. This is a part 1 and a part 2. We've had 5 transition trials. So these are studies approved under the CTD, which then transition in a quite simple process to being regulated under the CTR. And we will be publishing more guidelines on that process. It is quite straightforward, and we'd encourage people to do that. Across those 6 new applications have been a number of different areas of research. There's been COVID-19 and pandemic response. There's been a trial in monkeypox, in EB, in systemic sclerosis, and in cerebral hemorrhage. So a broad range and a broad different aspect of experience for the committee. We've had a number of learnings to date, and I'm going to finish on this slide before I hand over to my colleague Lucia. So the CTIS system, as with any online system, has had a number of glitches, and it's just required a lot of responsiveness from the National Office team to ensure that deadlines are met and all of the part 1 and part 2 aspects are adhered to. So we've had to be very responsive on the system and in contact with our HPRA colleagues at all times. It's a very straightforward application dossier. It's actually very easy to navigate. Everything's divided into sections, and that's been quite preferable compared to the version on the CTD. For part 1, a risk assessment is carried out by my colleague Jane as Programme Officer. So this is a trial synopsis to look for ethical concerns identifiable with any part 1 documents, such as when in the protocol, issues related to consent or vulnerable populations, etc. And this will be communicated to the committee as part of their review. The European harmonisation has been fantastic. There is weekly meetings of a coordination group to talk through issues, to sort of align things such as our signatures really needed on this document and to make things as straightforward as possible. As I said, we're working with the HPRA for this national coordination, so there's meetings and consultations with our colleagues in the HPRA on a regular basis, and it's a fantastic working relationship, and we look forward to that continuing. It's been fantastic for Ireland. And we've had 1 experience to date of being the reporting member state, as I mentioned. So this is coordination of the response for the part 1 and Ireland being that lead. So the National Office working in close coordination with the HPRA. And it's an extra ask of the National Office and of the NREC-CT with tighter deadlines. So we've had 1 experience to date, which has gone very well. And we hope to continue under that same trajectory. So on that note, I'm going to finish and hand over to Lucia. So thank you very much, Lucia, and thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and welcome to all our participants. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you here this morning. Over the next couple of minutes, I will give you a brief overview of the NREC-MD, so the National Research Ethics Committee for Medical Devices, as we call it, the shorter name. but the full title of the committee is National Research Ethics Committee for Clinical Investigations of Medical Devices and Performance Study of In Vitro Diagnostic Devices, Medical Devices. So, before I get into the details of the legislation and the committee itself, I thought it might be helpful to provide a brief overview of what actually falls under this broad term of devices. And as you can see, there's a number of devices on this slide, some of which have been to date reviewed by the NREC-MD, and they vary hugely in their size, their use, the technology behind them. So some of them are implantable stents, some of them, in some cases, the device itself is software, some of them are as simple as a face mask. So that is quite important to keep in mind when looking at the scope of the committee and also the expertise that we have present on the committee. As of May of 2022, a new group of devices falls under the European regulations. So these are the in vitro diagnostic medical devices. And I have included a brief example there in the slide. So one of them all of you are fairly familiar with, which is the COVID test. But also, I suppose there is much broader range of in vitro diagnostic devices, such as self-tested glucose devices or some DNA kits that now fall under that regulation. But I will speak to that in greater detail in a few minutes. So another key important area to keep in mind when we're looking at the world of devices is the way the devices are developed and brought onto market. So compared to medicinal products, the standard clinical developmental phases are a lot less standardized and are hugely dependent on the products. The same goes for the clinical study design. This process is a lot less standardized, and, for example, very rarely you would see animal studies included in devices because it's not necessarily always practical or relevant for the device itself. When it comes down to the irreversible effects on the study subjects, these are actually much more common, especially when we're considering devices that are basically permanent implants. And when it comes down to the types of organizations in the world of devices, these vary hugely. So from small startups and university labs to large multinational companies. So when it comes down to the drivers of the European regulatory developments, both Emily and Sue have touched on this earlier, but just in terms of the devices, there's again some key considerations to keep in mind. So some of them being the generic in terms of the objective to improve transparency in reporting, harmonization across EU and coordination of assessments. But of course, the world of devices has also been touched by some high-profile failures and recalls of devices over the last number of years. And it's also quite important to consider how much the technology has moved on over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And therefore, the need to regulate devices has been much more increased. So when we talk about the developments, I will predominantly focus on the impact on the research ethics committees. There has been obviously a number of changes that have been introduced by both the medical device regulation that has been implemented in May 21 and the in vitro diagnostic medical device regulation, which was implemented in May 2022. And they provide clarification in terms of the scope and classification of devices. They introduced European Medical Device Database UDAMED. They outlined the role of economic operators, notified bodies. It's huge, and I would highly recommend to have a look at some of the HPR presentations on this topic. The link there is provided in the slide. When we look at the REC impact, the key change has been the change to the clinical evaluation process, which now mandates for national REC review. The regulations also provides the remit for the NREC-MD, so what studies are subject to review by such committee, national committee. They also provide a mandate for single national REC decision. So again, applications that have been reviewed by the NREC-MD don't require a second REC review by a local institution. However, of course, there may be other review that the local institution may have in place instead to facilitate such studies going on in their institution. And then also the regulations and I suppose the statutory implements as they have been implemented in Ireland speak about independent process from the HPRA review. So unlike the move that we can see on the clinical trial side of things under CPR, where the assessment is carried out in close cooperation, it is much more separate in devices. So generally what we would see is that applicants often come to us first and then they apply to HPRA because the NREC-MD approval or favorable decision is a necessary component of the authorization from the HPRA. And here I'd also like to mention that whilst we do have separate processes, we are in a very regular contact with our colleagues from the Medical Devices Division of the HPRA, and we have found this collaboration extremely helpful over the last number of months as we were navigating the new waters of regulation of devices. So when it comes down to the NREC-MD remit, as I said, the NREC-MD reviews ethics applications that relate to clinical investigations. So these are studies that fall under the medical device regulation, and applications for performance studies. So these are the in vitro diagnostic devices, right? And then also the NREC-MD provides an oversight of studies that have been approved under the previous regulations, directive, the medical device directive, and also of the studies that would be now reviewed under both regulations. So when it comes down to the definitions as per the regulations for the devices, the term used in the regulation is clinical investigation of medical devices. Previously, these would have been called clinical evaluations, but now it's clinical investigations. And the regulation defines them as systemic investigations that involve one or more human subjects that are undertaken to assess the safety or performance of a medical device. Whereas compared to that, the performance studies of in vitro diagnostic devices the definition is a lot slimmer, and it speaks about study undertaken to establish or confirm the analytical or clinical performance of an in vitro device. So I suppose the key things to highlight here is that the objective of the study matters. So in both, the device is, and I suppose its performance or its safety or its ability is the key focus or one of the key objectives of the study. So not every study that involves a device does necessarily fall under the NREC-MD remit. I would also like to highlight that for the performance studies of in vitro diagnostic devices, the studies don't necessarily have to involve active human subjects, so these can be carried out on leftover samples, and there is specific considerations that need to be taken in mind when planning to carry out such studies. In general, what we would recommend for any applicants, if you're not sure if your study falls under the regulations and the remit of either HPRA or NREC-MD review, please contact us directly, or please contact our colleagues in the HPRA to help you determine whether or not your study does fall under the regulations. Now, this is a fairly busy slide. It talks about the different types of studies that we see, but one of the quite frequent questions that we have received and that we receive still is a question about observational studies that involve registry. So I thought it might be helpful just to talk about the different types of studies when it comes down to the devices. So typically, the types of studies that are submitted to NREC-MD review fall into one of three categories. First of them being pre-market studies. So these are often carried out for the purpose of obtaining CE marking. Then we also see some post-market studies, some of which may involve additional or burdensome procedures, or maybe using the device outside of its initial CE marking. But also we often see observational studies, so device registries. So these are long-term observational studies of actually studying how the device performs in real life. And then the last type of studies that is commonly submitted to the NREC-MD are substantial modifications or amendments. So any changes to already approved study also fall under the remit of the NREC-MD. So I spoke a lot about the NREC-MD, but who who is the committee? So who are the members? So first and foremost, I feel like we have been extremely lucky to have a group of very committed expert members from all walks of life that are members of the committee. Currently, the NREC-MD has 24 members, and similar to the clinical trials committees, we have recently or earlier this year increased in membership to meet the demands of the applications, but also to accommodate the review of studies that fall under IVDR. The committee meets monthly and reports to Minister for Health, and the National Office provides operational support to the committee. And the expertise across the committee is second to none. We have members with expertise in AI, computer science, engineering, in various medical disciplines, economy, ethics, law, medical device development, molecular medicine, genetics. We have extremely engaged members from that represent the PPI initiative and then also statistics. On the side of the team, our current NREC-MD team is a team of 2. So you can imagine it's fairly busy, but so far we've been able to manage the workload. And obviously, as I highlighted before, we are very upfront about and also monitoring capacity very closely. So when it comes down to the volume of applications, it has been busy, is one way of saying it, and we can see a huge change from 21 to 22 and the volume of applications that have been submitted and also and reviewed by the NREC-MD. So in 2021, in total, we would have received so far 38 applications that were also reviewed by the committee and additional 32 applications that were deemed invalid. When it comes down to the substantial amendments, we have received only 3 applications that were deemed invalid and 20 that were deemed valid and were reviewed by the NREC-MD. So in total, in the last 18 months, the committee has reviewed 58 applications, and there were additional 35 applications that were received, processed by the National Office, and deemed invalid. And this is just a brief chart to illustrate the difference in terms of received and reviewed. Also, just to note, while the IVDR has been in place since May, we have so far received just 1 application to the National Office. This one has been deemed invalid, but we anticipate that it will be resubmitted before the end of 2022. Now, similarly to the NREC-CTs under CTR, the committee, when it needs or requires more information on a particular application, can issue 1 request for further information following the initial meeting of the NREC-MD, and then issues a decision subsequently to ensure that we meet the timelines as set out by the regulations. And I thought it would be quite interesting to highlight that for new applications, it's less than 1 in 5 applications that receive a final decision following the first meeting. So more often than not, the committee requires further information or clarifications. When it comes down to substantial amendments, this is split. So 3/4 of applications receive a decision following the first meeting, and only in 1/4 the committee felt like more information was required in order for them to make an informed decision on an application. Finally, when we look at the decisions themselves, again, keeping in mind that the committee can only ask for 1 request for further information, or generally tends to ask just 1 request for further information. 2 out of 3 new applications so far have received a favorable decision, and approximately 23% have received unfavorable decision. When it comes down to substantial amendments, about 90% of applications have received favorable decision and 10% unfavorable. So on average, 3/4 of all applications so far have been deemed favorable, and about 1/4 unfavorable or have been withdrawn or are expecting decision. In terms of the timelines, the average time from submission to decision is 33 days. So This does not include the stop clock if there is a request for further information issued, but that one is usually set for 2 weeks. So even with that, the timeline is usually within a month. And that's all for me in terms of the NREC-MD.